never know what you'll find when you step into your own kitchen unannounced. For Richard Hamilton, one of the wealthiest businessmen in New York, that moment came late one Thursday afternoon when the sun was just beginning to set behind the skyline of his glass mansion. He had been in a tense board meeting all day, negotiating contracts worth millions. But instead of celebrating, he came home restless, his mind unsettled. He decided to take a quiet walk through his house, hoping to escape the heavy noise of corporate life. But as he neared the kitchen, he froze. What he saw there would shake him to his core. At first, Richard thought he was imagining things. The rhythmic sound of clapping, the shuffle of shoes sliding across the marble tiles, and the faint melody of laughter drifted into the hall. Carefully, he leaned against the wall and peered in. His twins, Caleb and Naomi, both 10 years old, were moving with joy across the floor, spinning, clapping, and laughing in a way he hadn't seen in years. But they weren't alone. At the center of it all was Lena, the maid, young, black, and full of a radiant energy that seemed to fill the entire room. She was twirling and guiding the children, her face glowing with a warmth that transcended words. For Richard, the most astonishing part wasn't the dance itself, but the fact that his twins, born deaf, often locked away in their own silent world, were not just following along. They were thriving. They were smiling. Their eyes sparkled with life. For years, Richard had hired tutors, therapists and specialists, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to break through to his children, and yet none of them had ever drawn out the joy that Lena did in that moment. Watching them dance, hands moving gracefully in rhythm, bodies swaying in perfect sync, was like watching a hidden miracle unfold right in his kitchen. But as much as Richard was moved, another emotion stirred within him. Anger. He felt his chest tighten as old prejudices crept into his mind. Who was this woman to take liberties in his house? She was the maid. She was supposed to clean, to cook, to stay out of sight, not take over his kitchen like some performer. A storm of questions raced through his head. Why hadn't she asked permission? Why had she crossed that line? And most of all, why did it take her, of all people, to connect with his children when the best money could buy had failed? Richard stepped into the room and instantly the music of laughter stopped. The twins froze, their bright faces dimming in fear. Lena straightened her back, her expression shifting from joy to dread. She knew what it meant when men like Richard caught women like her doing something out of place. She had lived long enough to understand how quickly kindness could be punished, how dignity could be stripped away with a single cruel word. Richard's eyes locked on her. What's going on here? His voice was cold, measured, the kind of tone that could cut glass. Lena lowered her gaze, her hands trembling slightly. Sir, Before she could finish, Naomi clung to her arm, shaking her head fiercely, trying to sign words that only Lena seemed to understand. Caleb, too, raised his hands, moving quickly in the language of signs, his face desperate, pleading. Richard didn't know sign language. He had always relied on interpreters, but he could read the fear in their movements. They asked me to dance, Lena said softly, her voice steady despite the tension. They wanted to feel the rhythm. I was only trying to make them happy. Her words echoed in the silence. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a long moment no one moved. The twins stood beside Lena like soldiers protecting their commander, refusing to let go. It was clear. They trusted her in a way they had never trusted anyone else. Richard's first instinct was to fire her on the spot, to remind her of her place. That was how men of his stature were supposed to respond. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the tears forming in Naomi's eyes. Maybe it was the way Caleb's hands kept signing a word over and over. Something Richard didn't understand but felt deep in his bones. Or maybe it was the realization that for all his wealth, all his power, he had never been able to give his children this simple, unfiltered joy. Still, his pride wouldn't let him surrender so easily. You think this is your role? To dance in my kitchen? To teach my children what I cannot? His voice was sharp, but beneath it was confusion, almost fear. Lena lifted her head then, meeting his gaze directly. It was a dangerous thing to do, but she couldn't back down. No, sir. My role is to serve. But I'm also human. And your children? They needed to feel seen. Dancing isn't just movement, it's freedom. For them, it's a voice they don't have. I only gave them what they were asking for. Her words hit harder than Richard expected. For years, he had poured his life into business, climbing the ladder of success, buying mansions and cars, but always at a distance from the struggles of everyday people. And here was this young black woman paid to clean his floors, teaching him something about humanity he had overlooked. The silence stretched on, thick as the evening shadows. Finally, Richard turned away, unable to process the storm inside him. "Enough for today," he muttered. "Everyone to their rooms." The twins hesitated, unwilling to release Lena's hand, but slowly, reluctantly, they obeyed. Lena stood still, her chest rising and falling with quiet strength, knowing that her fate was now in his hands. Richard walked out, but the image of that dance stayed with him. No matter how hard he tried to push it aside, he couldn't erase the memory of his children's joy, or the unsettling truth that it was Lena, not him, who had unlocked it. That night, as he sat alone in his study, staring out at the city lights, he realized something was shifting inside him, but he didn't yet know whether it would lead to confrontation, transformation, or something else entirely. The night stretched on longer than usual in the Hamilton mansion. Richard poured himself a glass of scotch, but it sat untouched on his desk as the images from earlier replayed in his mind. His twins dancing, laughing, moving in sync with Lena as though she had unlocked a secret chamber in their souls. The memory clashed against his pride, his upbringing, his understanding of class and power. Richard had been raised to believe that money could fix anything, that if you threw enough wealth at a problem, it would eventually bend to your will. But all his money hadn't given his children what Lena had managed in a single afternoon. That truth gnawed at him like a splinter under the skin. Around midnight, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Curious, he stepped outside and found Naomi wandering, holding her teddy bear tightly. She was signing quickly with her hands, her face urgent. Richard sighed. He couldn't understand. He crouched down, feeling useless, until she pointed insistently toward the servants' quarters. Against his better judgment, he followed her. When they reached Lena's door, Naomi knocked gently before slipping inside. Richard hesitated, torn between pride and curiosity, then stepped in after her. The room was simple, almost bare compared to the luxury of the rest of the house. A small bed, a wooden dresser, a single framed picture of an older woman, perhaps her mother. Lena sat on the bed, her hair wrapped in a scarf, reading a worn book under dim light. She looked up, startled, when she saw Richard in the doorway. "Sir?" she asked, rising quickly. Naomi ran to her, climbing into her lap with the ease of a child who trusted completely. Lena's arms wrapped around her instinctively, protective and tender. Richard stood frozen, watching a bond he had never been able to share with his daughter. "Why?" Richard finally asked, his voice low but heavy with emotion. "Why do they trust you this much?" Lena met his gaze with quiet courage. "Because I listen," she said. "Not with my ears, but with my heart. They don't need pity, Mr. Hamilton. They don't need doctors telling them what they can't do. They need someone willing to step into their silence and meet them there. I learned sign language years ago, from my cousin who was born deaf. Your children saw me use it once. From that day, they wouldn't let me go." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. His twins had begged him countless times to learn their language, but he had always been too busy, hiding behind the excuse of endless meetings and obligations. He had left it to interpreters and teachers, never taking the time himself. And here was Lena, a maid earning a fraction of what he spent on one business dinner, giving them the one thing he hadn't herself. Still, his pride resisted. "You've overstepped," he said firmly, though his voice wavered. "Your job is to clean, to cook, to keep order in this house, not to insert yourself into their lives." For a moment, pain flickered across Lena's face, but then she stood taller, her voice calm but unyielding. "With respect, sir, they invited me in. I only gave what they asked for. Attention, joy, dignity. If that's overstepping, then maybe the line is in the wrong place." Her words struck like lightning. Richard, a man who commanded boardrooms with sheer force of will, found himself speechless before a maid. He turned abruptly, storming out of the room, but not before noticing Naomi clinging tighter to Lena, refusing to let go. The following morning, tension crackled through the mansion. The twins refused breakfast unless Lena sat with them. Richard watched in silence as she guided them, teaching them new signs, even weaving dance-like motions into their communication. They were learning faster with her than they ever had with their expensive tutors. By mid-afternoon, Richard couldn't take it anymore. He summoned Lena to his study. She entered quietly, folding her hands in front of her, but her eyes held steady. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, studying her as though she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You do realize," he began slowly, "that what you're doing could cost you your job. There are boundaries in this house." "I understand, sir," Lena replied, her voice unwavering. "But I also know those children need more than boundaries. They need bridges, and if I have to risk my position to give them that, then so be it." Richard was stunned by her audacity. Most employees in his world bowed, scraped and tiptoed around him, terrified of losing the financial security he provided. Yet here was Lena, a black woman working as a maid in a billionaire's home, standing in front of him without fear. "Do you know what people would say?" Richard pressed, his tone sharper. "If they saw this? That I let the help raise my children? That I couldn't handle my own family?" Lena's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "Maybe they'd say the truth," she answered softly. "That money can't buy love. That love is given freely, no matter who it comes from." The words sliced through the air, leaving a silence so deep that even the city traffic outside seemed to vanish. Richard's jaw clenched as memories of his late wife flooded back, the woman who had begged him to spend more time with their children before cancer took her away. He had drowned his grief in business, convincing himself that providing wealth was enough. But Lena had exposed the hollowness of that belief with nothing more than a dance in the kitchen. Finally, Richard leaned forward, his voice lower, stripped of its usual authority. "How do you do it?" Lena tilted her head, puzzled. "Do what?" "Reach them," he whispered. "Make them so alive." For the first time, Lena smiled, not out of defiance, but with genuine warmth. "I don't try to fix them, sir. I just meet them where they are. Their silence isn't emptiness, it's music waiting to be heard. You just have to learn to listen differently." Her words hit him harder than any boardroom negotiation ever had. Richard sat back, exhaling deeply, as though a weight he had carried for years was finally cracking. That evening, Richard found himself doing something he had never done before. He sat at the dinner table with his children without his phone, without distractions. When Naomi began to sign, he struggled to mimic her movements, clumsy but determined. Caleb laughed at his father's awkward attempts. But his laughter wasn't mocking, it was joyful, encouraging. For the first time in years, the three of them were connected, however imperfectly, and all because of Lena. Richard couldn't deny it anymore. The woman he had nearly fired was not just a maid. She was the bridge his family had been waiting for. But he also knew the world outside wouldn't see it that way. Society had a way of twisting stories, especially when they involved black women in power. He had a choice to make: cling to pride and prejudice, or embrace the uncomfortable truth that his children's happiness depended on Lena's courage. That night, as he watched his twins fall asleep with smiles still lingering on their faces, Richard made his decision. What happened next in the kitchen would not just shock him, it would change his family forever. The morning sun spilled across the Hamilton mansion like golden paint, casting long streaks of light through the glass windows. For once, the house didn't feel cold or cavernous, it felt alive. The smell of pancakes filled the air. The sound of feet pattering across polished marble floors echoed. And in the kitchen, Lena was once again moving gracefully, guiding Caleb and Naomi as they clapped, stomped, and laughed in a rhythm only they could feel. Richard stood in the doorway again, but this time there was no anger in his chest, no indignation, only a deep stirring awe. He watched as his twins' small hands signed along to the beat of a song only Lena seemed to hear. Every spin, every clap, every stomp carried meaning. It wasn't just play, it was communication, a bridge across the silence that had once imprisoned them. "Good morning, sir," Lena said when she noticed him, her voice steady but cautious. The memory of his harsh tone 2 nights earlier still lingered between them. Richard raised a hand to stop her from stiffening into formality. "No," he said quietly. "Don't stop, please, keep going." Lena hesitated, then nodded, turning back to the children. Caleb signed something quickly, his hands moving with urgency, his eyes darting toward his father. Lena smiled and translated softly. "He's asking if you'll dance with him." Richard froze. Dance? He hadn't danced in decades, not since his wife was alive. He was a man of control, of sharp suits and iron discipline. Dancing felt vulnerable. But the look on Caleb's face, hopeful, almost pleading, melted his hesitation. "All right," he muttered, loosening his tie. He stepped forward awkwardly as Lena guided him into the circle. Naomi grabbed his hand, small fingers clutching tightly. and together they moved. At first Richard was stiff, his steps clumsy, but soon laughter bubbled out of his children like pure sunlight. And then something miraculous happened. Richard began to laugh too. The sound startled him, rough and unfamiliar, but it grew until it filled the room. For the first time since his wife's passing, he felt like a father again. When the dance ended, Caleb and Naomi clapped wildly, their silent cheers filling the kitchen. With more life than any boardroom victory ever had, Richard's chest ached, not with sorrow, but with something new. Gratitude. Later that day, Richard called Lena to the study. She entered cautiously, unsure what awaited her. She had lived her whole life on the edge of dismissal, aware that one wrong move could cost her everything. Richard gestured for her to sit. "Lena," he began, his tone softer than she had ever heard it. "You've done more for my children in a week than the best specialists have done in years. You've given them joy. You've given me a chance to be their father again." Lena swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Sir, I only—" "No," he interrupted gently. "You've done far more than only. And I realize now that I was blind. I thought money could solve everything, that hiring the best was enough. But what my children needed wasn't money. It was heart. It was patience. It was you." Her breath caught in her throat. She had heard many words in her life, commands, criticisms, dismissals, but rarely gratitude from men like Richard. He opened a drawer, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the desk. "This is for you," he said simply. Lena looked down, her hands trembling as she picked it up. Inside was a check, an entire year's worth of her salary multiplied by 3. She gasped, staring in disbelief. "Sir, I can't accept this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can and you will," Richard replied firmly, though his tone was kind. "It's not just a bonus. It's recognition. Recognition for the dignity and love you've given my family. Something I can never repay fully, but I'll try." Tears welled in Lena's eyes. She tried to steady herself, but emotion flooded through her. "All I ever wanted was to give them a voice," she said softly. "People underestimate them because they cannot hear. People underestimate me because I clean floors. But we are more than what the world reduces us to." Richard's throat tightened. Those words, spoken with quiet fire, held the weight of generations of injustice, yet also the unshakable pride of a woman who knew her worth. He nodded slowly, humbled. "You're right," he admitted, "and it took me too long to see it." From that day forward, things in the Hamilton household changed. Richard made a promise to his children and to himself that he would no longer stand apart from their world. He began learning sign language in earnest, fumbling through lessons at first, but with Lena's patient guidance he improved. Each evening, the 4 of them would gather in the kitchen, not just to eat but to dance, to laugh, to share a language that was more powerful than words. The neighbors whispered, of course. People in Richard's circle questioned why a billionaire was lowering himself, spending so much time with his maid, letting her influence his children. But Richard no longer cared. He had lived for too long in a cage of appearances. Now he was free, and so were his children. One night, months later, as Richard tucked Naomi into bed, she signed clumsily but with clear determination. "Thank you, Daddy." Richard's chest tightened as he signed back with equal clumsiness. "No, thank you." Down the hall, Lena sat by the window of her small room, gazing at the framed photo of her mother. She whispered softly into the night, "I kept my dignity, Mama. They finally saw me." In the grand story of wealth and power, it wasn't contracts or fortunes that changed Richard Hamilton's life. It was a dance in the kitchen, led by a woman the world had tried to overlook. A woman who taught him that dignity doesn't come from titles or bank accounts. It comes from the courage to love, even when the world tells you not to. And in that courage, Lena gave the Hamilton family something money could never buy. Connection, pride, and a future built not on silence, but on joy.